Welcome everyone, this is Respiratory Care 440 Advanced Patient Monitoring Assessment. This is week 1, we're going to talk about measurement statistics and some terminology. Your goals for week 1 is you're going to understand some key terms as they relate to measurement statistics. It's not going to be in this presentation, but you're going to gain some understanding of APA, and hopefully it won't put you to sleep, because some of this is going to be a review for a lot of you out there. So first up, why patient monitoring? So patient monitoring is important because it can provide us a lot of information about our patient's current condition. It allows us early detection of status changes, and this is what lets us know when something changes and lets us intervene. And it's part of quality of care, so it can evaluate the cost effectiveness of treatment, care, and stuff that we're using. It allows us to focus on population care, and it allows us to standardize our. The first two terms that we need to go over are accuracy and precision. So accuracy is the closeness of a value to the known value. This would be how close the measurements are to the center of, or the bullseye in these examples. So if you look at that bottom right hand one, a lot of those bullet marks, I guess you'd call them, are really close to the center, right where they want them to be, so they're considered highly accurate. And we look at precision. This is the closeness of two or more values. And this isn't in regards to a known, so this is just the closeness of two or more measurements. So the best one to look at is that one in the top right, where you can see all the measurements are kind of grouped together. That would be considered highly accurate. And you can have one without the other, and you can have neither. So if you look at that top left one, you have low accuracy, low precision. If you go down to the bottom left, you have high accuracy, low precision. Top right, low accuracy, high precision. And the bottom is what you're always shooting for, is at high accuracy, high precision. Some more terms that you want to know is bias, to say under or overestimate of a true value by a consistent amount. We have reproducibility, and that's just considered your precision over time. And resolution is breaking it down to the smallest interval of a measurement that you can have. The last couple terms to know is sensitivity and specificity. So if you have trouble with this, there's that extra video I put out this week for you to get a little better understanding of that. But sensitivity is the ability to correctly identify true positives. So this is your ability to identify those. Say if you're testing for a disease, this is going to tell you what ones have the disease and able to weed out the ones that don't have the disease. And specificity is the ability to correctly identify true negatives. So this is going to comes down to ruling out your people that are identified as not having that disease. So the first thing that comes up with patient monitoring is alarms. If you work in an ICU or any type of critical care setting, you know all about alarms. And there's a couple different alarms you can get. You can get artifact alarms, you can get factitious alarms. You can also get real alarms, but they're actually only getting triggered because your alarms are set too tight. And this can lead to frequent alarming can cause providers to actually come down with alarm fatigue, which there's a lot more research popping up about this lately, and that's going to be becoming a lot more popular here in the next few years because it's a serious problem. So the best example of this is back when car alarms first came out. Is when we first had car alarms, and you heard a car alarm, everyone ran to their windows and they're looking outside and, oh, who's stealing my car? And after they looked 99, 100 times, they're like, all right, nobody's stealing my car. Why is this thing going off? And if you look at it now, when the last time you heard a car alarm going off where you actually felt like you even had to turn your head and look around? And I mean, it doesn't really happen anymore. And for car alarms, I mean, whatever, it's not a big deal. But when you're referring to a piece of equipment that is responsible for alerting us to someone's vital signs, or if they're having a heart attack, it's not as it's a little bit more significant. So that's not a good thing to have for providers. But yeah, more research is going to be coming up on this in the next few years, and hopefully we'll be able to do something about it. So the two types of measurements you're going to get is direct measurements and indirect measurements. So these are more statistical terms kind of that you need to know about. So direct measurements are the exact measurements that you are looking at. These are things like height, weight, length. I mean, you see them. And indirect measurements are something that's measured by something else. So this is your airway pressures, your EKG, So basically, your airway pressure, you don't look at the ventilator circuit and say, oh, yeah, this guy's got a peak airway pressure of 38 and a mean of 25. That's just not how it works. You have to rely on your sensors to tell you. The same with the EKG. You don't watch the electrical signal coming through a patient's heart and do your P's, your Q's, your QRS's, T's, all that stuff. You actually just rely on the monitor to do that for you. And some measurement errors. Basically, the two types you need to know about for this class are random and systematic. So random are considered unpredictable high-low. Those are the outliers, which that's just that one random measurement. So say you have a person on a ventilator, every breath their peak airway pressure is 25, 25, 25. All of a sudden, you look up and you see 32, then it goes 25, 25, 25. So in that example, that's just an outlier. It's just one weird measurement. And when you look at it on the right here, it's not going to change your distribution. Your mean's still going to be the same. You're just going to be a little bit wider on your mountain there. And systematic ones, these are the ones that occur over time. This is where that term bias comes back in. So this is where, let's say you had a sensor that was monitoring airway pressures, and it was 25, 25, and all of a sudden it goes 26, 26, 27, 28, 28, 29, 30, 30, 30, 32, and then you'd have to, see what's going on. Or maybe you'd have to recalibrate your sensor, look at your equipment, and try to redo it because, yeah, that's considered a bias or systematic. So some sources of error when it comes to mechanical ventilation that you're going to get are due to temperature, humidity. High humidity systems can tend to mess up your pressure flow sensors a little bit and can cause some errors. Also, the type and viscosity of the gas you're using can cause some problems. The best example of this is when you're going from using like air-oxygen mixtures to like heliox. So a lot of it, or most ventilators aren't calibrated to use helium as a source gas. They're only calibrated to use air and oxygen. So if you go and start throwing heliox on these ventilators, there's actually going to be a lot of like errors. The volume and pressures that you're reading aren't going to be accurate because they're not. You're actually, the ventilator you're using was calibrated to use something else. So, sorry. So the best thing you can do is if you're actually using heliox on a ventilator, is you got to call your manufacturer and just ask them what they recommend that you do in that situation, because you can't go out and buy a new ventilator just for one patient, but you got to talk to them and see what it is. You're also gonna have some errors depending on your gas flow, whether it's laminar or turbulent, barometric pressure. And this comes back to all your ventilators are they're calibrated to be working at sea level, so you'll mainly see those if you're the type that goes on fixed wing transports, but those are actually, haven't met too many people that have been doing those lately. Also the response time of your sensors, location of your sensors, and if you have any dampening on your sensors. So patient monitoring is a useful technology, and it really does help us a lot, but it can't replace your actual patient assessment when you look, listen, and feel at your patients. So this is what we get. I get some problems with this where I see some residents coming in and they're they're getting their patient assessment based on the EMR and the computer screen. They're not actually even seeing the patient. So it's a blessing and a curse. You don't want to rely on it too much, but it is useful. Sorry. Okay, part 2. Now we're going to jump into the beef. Ventilator graphics. So, a little disclaimer. This is, for some of you it might be a review. For some of you it might not be as much a review. It just kind of depends on your background. So we're going to go over everything. And, yeah, hope you... Things that we're measuring on our ventilator graphics are pressure, flow, volume, time, carbon dioxide. So you have 4 parts of your mechanical breath. You have your trigger, you have your inspiratory phase, your cycle phase, your expiratory. So, in your trigger, that's where your breath starts. You have your initiation. It's either based on pressure, flow, or time, depending on your mode, user, or what you're using. You also have trigger pressures, inspiratory rise or trigger time, rise time, and delay time. So asynchronies, trigger asynchrony is something that comes up with your, is an error that can come up with your, triggering. So auto triggering, that's one problem. Mistriggering, this is where you don't have your sensitivity set appropriately. Double triggering, this can happen when your sensitivity is set too high, or I guess too sensitive would be the way to say it. And that's where it's just you can get some breath stacking, and that leads to your air trapping, which we're going to talk a lot more in later. So people at risk for trigger asynchrony are usually people that have a lot of pressure support, high tidal volumes, they have COPD or the presence of autopeep, or they also patients that are getting inline nebulizers. And these are the small volume, not really the multi-dose inhalers. Those won't have too much of a problem with your ventilator, but the inline nebulizers will. Inspiratory phase. So this is when your flow is delivered. You can have your fixed flow, variable flow, combined flow, which we'll talk about in the next couple of slides. So you can also have inappropriate flow. It's where you have too little, too much, and it can contribute to things like patient asynchrony and auto. The cycle phase. This is between inspiration and expiration, and this is where the overdistension occurs, which is another topic that we're going to have, I believe, next week or week 3. But expiratory phase. This is where the air leaves the patient and hopefully gets released to atmosphere. And your expiratory phase can actually be extended in some patients, and this is usually due to time constants, which again is another lecture for another day, which is coming up, which I can't remember. It's either week 2 or 3, but we'll get to this in some pretty good depth. So why ventilator graphics? It allows us to interpret, evaluate, and troubleshoot the ventilator and the patient's response to the ventilator. It allows us to monitor our disease states, mainly through our compliance and resistance. It allows us to actually monitor how well the ventilator is functioning, and it allows us to fine-tune the machine so we can work on decreasing our work of breathing, optimizing patient comfort, and preventing ventilator-associated events. And that's kind of the new blanket term that the ARCs, is it ARC or the national, the NIH, one of those groups, but they're kind of grouping together all the bad things that can happen when you're on a ventilator and giving them an umbrella term called VIE instead of saying like ventilator-acquired pneumonia and barotrauma and stuff like that. And it just makes it easier to kind of track our quality. So the first or the 2 types of waveforms that you're going to see are scalar and loops. I'm really going to be talking about scalars in this presentation. So scalars are that straight line. That's where you plot pressure, volume, time, or pressure, volume, or flow against time, or time's on the x-axis. And loops, where you take out the time and you just have pressure, volume, and flow. And we have our 6 waveforms there that we're going to talk about a little bit more. So we have our pressure waveforms. Here's our square, exponential ride, sinusoidal. Our flow waveforms, descending ramp, square, exponential decay, sinusoidal, ascending ramps, and some volume waveforms, sinusoidal again, and ascending ramp. Remember, spontaneous breathing patients always are in that sinusoidal waveform. So these are just basically what they're going to be looking like. Yeah, give it a second to take that all in. Looks pretty nice, huh? So, pressure time. In the volume modes is what you're going to be seeing there on the left. You're going to see the exponential rise, or accelerating ramp, whatever you call it. And then it's going to be dropping back down. In the pressure mode, the shape's going to be square, rectangle, whatever you like to call it. This just means that the pressure remains constant throughout the breath. So using your pressure time, it's useful because you can tell air trapping, obstruction, bronchodilator response, your compliance and resistance, active exhalation, which would be patient synchrony, and then a couple other things down there. So this is where you just see patient effort versus non-patient effort, and that's just where you have a negative deflection there in front of that second waveform there, and that just means there's patient effort. But I know a lot of ventilators now, they'll color code that depression or the patient initiation for you, so you know if your patient's breathing spontaneously or not. But, and here we have just how the breath's broken down. So we have initiation of respiration, and it goes up to 1, where it's your peak inspiratory pressure, drops down to your plateau pressure, and then exhales out. And yeah, we'll talk about that a little bit more. And the big thing to remember is when you have your mean airway pressure, that's actually the average that's calculated from all of those values. So I'll show you how here in the next slide. So someone with increased airway resistance. Remember, the airway resistance is somebody that has a large volume or a large difference between their plateau pressure and their PIP. And that's what you're seeing on the left side. So that patient probably just needs suctioned. If we look here on the right, somebody with decreased compliance, that's where your plateau and your PIP are pretty close, but the plateau is actually pretty high. You can see how our mean airways pressure is different when we talked about that last slide by looking at the volume that's underneath the that curve there. So the one on the right, there's actually more volume there, so that mean is going to be a little bit higher than on the left. So here's our volume flow or volume over time waveform. Basically, this is a mountain. Left side air goes in, right side air goes out, and sometimes you can have a peak, or not a peak, but a plateau at the top of that. And that's sometimes if there's like an inspiratory hold or inspiratory pause. Your volume waveform is important because you can tell air trapping, leaks, active exhalation, asynchrony, and your tidal volume delivery. And look at here, you can see just the left side is your inspiration peaks, and then right side is expiration. So the thing you're going to be seeing that you can is your leaks. So here we have on the right side of the graph is your exhalation. You see that dotted line where it goes back to baseline. That's where it should be. But if you look in and you see it actually drops off in a straight line down there. So that just means that you're losing volume somewhere. And it doesn't just disappear. It's got to go somewhere. Whether you find it or not is another story. But by looking at this graph, you can say that there's a leak somewhere. It might be in the ET tube, the circuit. There might be a chest tube or something else. So our flow over time graphs. Your volume mode over here on the left, it's going to be square, rectangle, whatever you like to call that. That just means that flow is consistent throughout the cycle of the breath. And if you're in a pressure mode or any of those other fancy ones, it's going to be a decelerating ramp. So in the left, you're going to be hitting your peak flow and staying there. And on the right, you're going to get to a high flow, and then it's kind of trickle down a little bit until you get your full volume. Again, you're going to tell basically about the same stuff as all the other ones when you look at there, but this one you're going to be able to tell a little bit more about bronchodilator response. And so these are the two differences we had for the square waveform versus the decelerating ramp. And the next slide, here's where it's different. So when we're comparing these two, is we have the left, we have the what do we have? Our square waveform, and on the right we have our decelerating flow. And so the difference here is on the left, you can see our peak pressure is 29 and our tidal volume delivered was 502. So if we had that same patient and put them in the pressure mode, their peak pressure would only be 26 and their tidal volume delivered would be 516. So with the decelerating flow pattern, you may be able to deliver the same or a little bit more tidal volume with a low peak inspiratory pressure, but when it comes down to it, the difference is really only 3 centimeters of water pressure. You're only getting 10 more milliliters of volume. So whether that's going to be much of a clinical significance is really up to you. But this also leaves out some other important information like your plateau pressures and the such. So, but that's just important to remember. Air trapping is a big topic that we're going to cover a lot of in this class, and I think it's next week. But that's basically when your flow doesn't return to baseline before the next breath. You can see that dotted line there is what you want, is you want your flow to come all the way back up to 0 before the next breath starts. And you can see on this example is it doesn't come back to 0. So again, when we said that volume has to go somewhere, now you have a little bit that's kind of sitting somewhere, and usually it's going to be in their lungs, and you're going to have stacking and stacking, and then they're going to get hyperinflated, and it's not a very good thing for your patient. So bronchodilator response. So this is a good example for showing how well a patient can respond to bronchodilator. So if you look at our first waveform there, the patient doesn't get a very high or low, I guess the way you're looking at it, but it's considered high. They don't get a really high peak expiratory flow. And there's a really long expiratory time there. And if you look between the two graphs, right there in the middle, somehow they managed to time a couple puffs of albuterol, I guess, And on the next waveform, actually their peak flow was higher, and their expiratory time actually went down a lot. So this patient had a pretty good response to the bronchodilator. And here's just some examples of your flow not returning to baseline. So you see on the left is what you want, but on the right there, it's circled in the red where your flow just isn't getting back to baseline, so you're going to have some air trapping. Leaks. We all know about leaks. Just so you know, expiratory leaks, you consider leaks around your ET2 cuff, chest tube, fistula, maybe somebody put an NG in the trachea instead of the esophagus and it's just going out to atmosphere. Inspiratory leaks, you just want to look at your connections, look at your circuits, check your sensors. You can identify it a couple different ways. You can just read through that if you want. And how do you fix it is basically you check all this, check your machine, check the patient, and yeah, you can do a leak test if you still can't locate it, and when all else fails, just get a new one. Not a patient, a new ventilator. The Asynchrony. This is a problem where your patient's just not really being very compliant with the vent. They're not comfortable for whatever reason. Some of these causes are usually inappropriate flow rates are triggering. So we have air hunger, flow starvation. I don't like the term, but that just means inappropriate flow. Sometimes neurological injuries. So if you work in a trauma ICU or somewhere where you get a lot of head injuries, you'll be seeing patients doing a lot of small breathing. And the last one's where basically it's your fault. You don't have the sensitivity set appropriately. So basically, you're going to identify this by seeing loops or dips in your flow volume, loops, which is next week's lecture, or you're going to see active inhalation or exhalation at any point throughout your waveforms. So you can fix it by, adjusting your flow, your I times, changing your ventilator rate, changing your ventilator mode. Sometimes you might need to paralyze or sedate, or maybe you just need to adjust your sensitivity to make it more appropriate for that. So that flow starvation or inappropriate flow, you look here on the left, that line should be straight. And the arrow shows it kind of droop again. So that's like another way that they call that is scooping out or dipping. And that's just inappropriate flow. That means the patient's sucking in harder, more flow than the ventilator is providing it. So to fix that, you just turn up your flow. If they're flow hungry, you give them flow, make them comfortable. Inspiratory cycle time and rise time. This is good because rise time, I get a lot of questions about this, and I haven't really heard a lot of people be able to answer rise time very appropriately. So we're gonna make you extra quick. Rise time determines the amount of time it takes to reach the desired airway pressure or peak flow rate, and that's basically it's just fine tuning of the flow valve. So the slide, the two for all these things, you need to remember it's either going to be too little, too much, or appropriate. So we look at our left here. This is where you have too fast of a rise time. So essentially, your breath's shooting in as hard as it can. You're getting a little pressure overshoot on the left side, and then it comes back down to where it should be. So this is basically your rise time is just too fast and needs to be extended a little bit. Let that flow valve open a little bit more slowly. And if you look on the right here, this is your the opposite, which would be too slow. And this is just the flow is not getting enough. There's too much time. It needs to be a little shorter. And when you get down to that point where you're drawing it out, your actual tidal volume might not be enough delivered. So you actually can cause their CO2 up to rise because you're not giving them enough of a tidal volume. So and that you just need to make your time a little shorter. So remember, rise time kind of manipulates the that flow valve. And I've heard some people call it the way that they can shape the the inhalation limb of the blah blah blah, but it's really just determining how fast the breath goes in. Cycle time, this is just a way of determining when the ventilator stops. Cycles from inspiration to expiration. It can be called a lot of things. We're not really gonna be hounding it too hard on this. It really depends where you work and what ventilators you're using. If you see this. So you can see there where it's circled, that just determines where ventilation ends. inspiration ends, and it's usually set at a percent of that 100% flow. So it can go down 75, 50, 30. It depends on what ventilator. And these are some examples again of it being too short or too high. So we have our that bottom left-hand corner where it's set at 60%. It's just cycling too soon. Your tidal volume is not going to get delivered. They're not getting enough air. They're going to probably end up air hungry after a little bit. If you look at our B picture there, this is where it's actually too long. They go all the way down to 10%. And you can see in the corresponding one of the graph on the top, where you can see the patient's actually exhaling. He's trying to breathe out while the ventilator's still pushing air in. So that's where you can see is a little bit of asynchrony. So basically you would just want to take it up to 15 or maybe 20%. But again, that depends what ventilators you're working with if you're going to see that. And that's all we have for you. So make sure you go into the assignment section, check that you participated in the video, and if you have any questions, shoot me an email or pop them up on the discussion board. But thanks. I hope you enjoyed the lecture.